Hey there, welcome back to the quiet side of time. Tonight, we drift along the Nile, into stone workshops and temple corridors, where artists shaped eternity with chisel and brush. Dim the lights, let your breath slow. Place your thoughts beside the pillow. I've saved something rare for the end. The night was wide and quiet, the desert stretching out like a vast sheet of linen beneath the stars. The river moved gently, a dark ribbon flowing through sand and silence. Its waters glimmered with fragments of starlight, steady, endless, and ancient beyond measure. Along its edges, the Nile whispered against reeds and clay banks, carrying with it the gifts that made life possible. Clay for shaping, reeds for writing, stone for carving, all drifting slowly into the hands of those who waited along the shore. The Nile was not only water, it was rhythm, it was memory, it was the breath that guided each creation. As dawn rose over its waters, the world of the artisans awoke, steady and unhurried. In the earliest villages, where mud brick houses clustered close to the river, hands were never idle. The people worked with what the river gave, turning earth into vessel, pigment, and wall. The smell of damp clay lingered in the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of reeds drying in the sun. Children carried baskets of Nile silt, while their parents shaped it into bricks, laying them one atop another, until walls rose strong enough to shelter generations. Mortars ground slowly, turning colored stones into fine powders. Ochre was crushed into reds and yellows, malachite into green, lapis into blue. The rhythm of pestle against stone was steady and low, a heartbeat of craft that echoed through the village. In this way, the walls of temples and tombs began not with the brush, but with the earth itself. When the floods came, the river spread out over the fields, leaving behind black silt, so rich it seemed a gift from the gods. Farmers rejoiced in its bounty, but artisans too found their treasures in the Nile's offerings. Mud thickened into workable clay, perfect for shaping jars, statues, and even the humble models placed in burials to serve the departed in eternity. Reeds grew tall and slender, waiting to be cut into pens, ready to carry words of devotion across papyrus sheets. Life along the Nile was quiet in its daily rhythm, yet everywhere there was the hum of making, the silent devotion of hands at work. Among the reeds and pigments, one of the oldest colors to emerge was a deep, shimmering blue unlike any found in nature. It was called Egyptian blue, the first synthetic pigment known to humankind. Artisans created it by heating sand, copper, and limestone together until the mixture transformed into a vivid hue, a color that seemed to hold the sky within it. Tiny granules of this pigment were carefully ground and mixed with water, then brushed across walls to paint gods, waters, and night skies. It was a color meant to endure, a pigment that did not fade easily, surviving thousands of years in hidden tombs. Egyptian blue was more than decoration. It was eternity in powdered form, a bridge between the earth and the heavens. As artisans brushed it onto the walls, children peered at the shining color, wide-eyed, as though they too held a fragment of the divine in their gaze. The river never hurried, and neither did the people who worked by its edge. Days were measured in sunlight and shadow, in the gentle passage of seasons, in the rising and falling of the Nile's floods. Life bent to its rhythm, as if each artisan was simply echoing the slow pulse of the river itself. Some shaped clay into vessels that held grain or oil. Others laid pigment onto plaster, recording the movement of daily life, fishing, planting, dancing, and offering prayers. Still others carved signs into stone, symbols that carried not just sounds, but stories, prayers, and records of time. The air was filled not with voices of fame, but with murmurs of continuity, with the quiet assurance that what was made with care would last. It was in these villages, tucked along the Nile, that the idea of eternity took form, not only in words and gods, but in objects shaped by human hands. The Nile moved on, carrying silt, reeds, and stone. Its waters touched each workshop, each pigment bowl, each quiet hand at work, and as the evening settled, the river murmured once more. A murmur that flowed into silence and into the next beginning. The desert was still, save for the faint sigh of the wind against stone. At dawn, the sky brightened slowly, washing temples in pale gold, each surface glowing as though the gods themselves traced the horizon with light. The walls stood like silent guardians, vast and unyielding, yet alive with forms that spoke without sound. Hieroglyphs shimmered faintly where the sun touched them, and carved figures seemed to stir in the shifting light. Every panel, every line, was more than image. It was lore, rhythm, and memory, set down in stone so it would never fade. The walls waited in silence, like scrolls unrolled for the attentive eye. In ancient Egypt, temples were not built only as places of worship. They were libraries of stone, each surface carrying stories of gods, kings, offerings, and balance. Step through their colonnades, and you would find the air cooler, hushed, thick with the smell of incense and the faint echo of footsteps. Shadows stretched along the carved walls, and as the sun shifted, so too did the figures appear to move across the stone. The artisans who carved these scenes followed strict rules. Figures walked in profile, their shoulders turned to face the viewer, their eyes wide and watching. The proportions were carefully measured, not freely drawn, but bound by a canon that endured for centuries. To create a figure was to uphold order itself, ma'at, the balance between chaos and harmony. You could see harvesters bending to gather grain, each stalk etched with the same steady care as the falcon-headed Horus. Even the smallest detail, a hand, a basket, a feather, was guided by rules of symmetry and proportion. To stray from those rules would not simply be a mistake, it would disrupt the eternal order woven into the universe. The scenes stretched endlessly, processions of gods and kings, offerings of bread and beer, sacred animals carved in sharp relief. In the flicker of torchlight, the walls became more than stone. They became movement, ritual, and the very breath of faith. Among the many walls, one rule of design held quietly firm, known today as the hieratic scale. It was the law that the size of each figure reflected not the body's true form, but the soul's importance. A king might tower over a servant, not because he was taller, but because his role carried more weight. So on the sandstone walls, gods loomed vast, their forms stretching higher than all others, while scribes, soldiers, and farmers were rendered smaller, each figure ordered in a silent hierarchy. This scale was not vanity, it was teaching. It reminded every viewer that the universe had an order, and that order must be preserved. In some temples, even the carved animals followed this rule. A sacred bull might stride larger than the men who led it, its importance given shape in stone. Children looking upon the scenes would learn at once. Size was not about the body, but about the soul's place in the eternal design. The walls were also filled with writing, thousands upon thousands of hieroglyphs. Each symbol was carved, with precision, the swoop of a bird's wing, the curl of a reed, the coil of a rope. Together, they formed not only words, but prayers and spells. The artisans who carved them were not always literate themselves. They followed drafts drawn by scribes onto plaster, cutting deep where the lines guided them. A single wall could take months, even years, to complete. First came the quarrying of stone, then the smoothing of its surface. Next, the outlines were sketched with red ochre. Masters corrected them in black. Then the chisels began their steady rhythm, cutting into the surface, filling the temple with a quiet percussion. When carving was complete, painters entered, brushing the figures with color. Green for fertility, red for life, blue for divinity, gold for the skin of gods. The walls came alive in vibrant tones, far brighter than the faded stone we see today. Inside the dim corridors, torchlight made the colors shimmer, as though the walls themselves were glowing. Day after day, pilgrims entered these spaces, their footsteps echoing on stone floors. They traced their fingers across the carved reliefs, whispering prayers to figures who seemed eternal. The walls held not only art, but memory. They carried lists of offerings, records of festivals, names of kings, and hymns to gods. To walk through the temple was to read a book of stone, one that never closed, one that always spoke in silence. And as the centuries passed, the walls endured. Sand might gather at their feet. Wind might weather their edges. Yet the figures still stood, graceful, balanced, eternal. Their silence was not emptiness, but presence. The voice of a civilization carved into the very bones of the earth. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the sandstone. Figures stood motionless, yet alive in the quiet light. Every line held the same balance, the same grace, unbroken. And the walls whispered still, waiting for the next gaze to listen. The sun rose slowly over the desert, turning the cliffs into pale amber and the river into silver glass. In the workshops tucked along the Nile's edge, quiet hands reached for stone bowls and smooth pestles. The air was heavy with the scent of dust, of crushed minerals, of earth being transformed. Before brush touched plaster, before images stirred on walls, there was always color. Powders sat in neat rows, shimmering like treasure, waiting to be mixed with water and gum. Each hue was more than decoration. It was meaning, a prayer given form, a promise set in pigment. Ochre was among the first, dug from the earth in soft clumps. It was crushed until it became fine and warm, glowing red or yellow in the light. Red ochre meant life, energy, the blood of being. Yellow ochre called to the eternal, the flesh of the gods. The radiance of raw malachite came from copper mines, its green surface veined like leaves. When ground, it became a soft, vivid powder, the color of fertility and rebirth. The green shoots rising after the Nile floods. To paint with malachite was to invoke growth, renewal, the eternal cycle of life returning. Then came lapis lazuli, a stone not native to Egypt, but carried across deserts and mountains from faraway Afghanistan. Its deep celestial blue was more precious than gold. Lapis was not common. It was reserved for the sacred, for the hair of the gods, for the night sky above eternity. To hold even a fragment of lapis was to hold a piece of the heavens themselves. In bowls of alabaster and stone, these minerals were crushed, ground, and mixed. Water was added drop by drop, and gum from the acacia tree bound the powders into paint. Artisans stirred carefully, whispering almost as they worked, for they knew each color carried not only beauty, but power. Among these pigments was one unlike any other, the first man-made color in history. It was known today as Egyptian blue. Unlike ochre or malachite, it did not come from the earth directly. Artisans learned to create it by heating sand, copper, and lime together at high temperatures. When cooled, it became a crystalline substance that, when ground, produced a brilliant turquoise blue. Egyptian blue was durable, resistant to fading even after centuries. It adorned statues, murals, and amulets, glowing with a light that seemed eternal. In dim torchlight, it reflected as though holding its own fire. To the Egyptians, it was the color of water, of the sky, of the divine. It was, quite literally, a manufactured eternity. Fragments of Egyptian blue have been found not only on temple walls, but also on small household objects. Reminders that color was woven into both sacred and daily life. Even the humblest bowl might carry a fragment of the eternal sky. Inside the tombs, color covered every surface. Farmers bent low over golden fields. Dancers raised their arms in rhythm. Gods stood serene with skin of green, blue, or gold. Each wall was a tapestry, alive with movement, each pigment layered carefully so that it would endure beyond death. The artisans followed conventions in their use of color. Male figures were often painted with reddish-brown skin. to echo the sun's warmth and the labor of the fields. Women were depicted with lighter, yellow-toned skin, symbolizing their indoor life and gentleness. The gods each carried their own hues: Osiris with green for rebirth, Amun with blue for creation, Hathor with gold for divinity. Even animals carried symbolic tones. The sacred ibis gleamed in white, the cobra in golden yellow, the bull in strong black, the cat in shimmering bronze hues. Every shade was chosen with care, never at random. To paint without meaning was to break the balance of the universe itself. Color was also layered upon relief. A wall might first be carved, its figures raised or cut into stone, then painted with bright hues that accentuated their form. Under torchlight, the effect was almost alive, the carved shapes catching shadow, the pigments glowing with intensity. In the still air of the tomb, it must have felt as though eternity itself was unfolding on the walls. Centuries passed, and the colors faded. Exposure to air, light, and time dulled their brightness. Yet even in their faded state, the pigments whispered of their former brilliance. Faint blues still clung to feathers of carved wings. Traces of red lingered on the outlines of a hand. 1,000 years could not silence them completely. In quiet chambers, where no visitor entered for millennia, the colors waited in darkness. There, hidden from the sun, they endured. Ochre still burned warmly on the walls. Malachite still glowed faintly green. Egyptian blue still shimmered as though it had just been brushed onto plaster. And when modern eyes finally entered those tombs, they found not just dust and silence, but color still alive. Color that carried the prayers of artisans across 3,000 years. The pigments had outlasted their makers, yet they still carried their intent, their devotion, their rhythm. The bowls lay empty now, their powders long scattered. Yet the walls still glow with faint breath of color. Shadows drift across the figures, soft and silent, and the brightest tones fade gently into dusk. The workshop was dim, lit by a single shaft of sun filtering through a narrow doorway. Dust hung in the air like fine mist, catching in the light. Around the floor lay half-formed statues, their features barely emerging from blocks of stone. The rhythm of chisels echoed gently, metallic, steady, like a distant heartbeat. Beyond the doors, the desert stretched in silence. Inside, the sculptors bent low, patient, unhurried, coaxing faces from granite as though summoning them from eternity. Their hands worked not with haste, but with reverence, as though the stone itself was sacred, waiting to be revealed. Granite, diorite, basalt, stones harder than iron, were the chosen materials of pharaohs. They were heavy, stubborn, resistant, yet their very difficulty gave them value. To carve a king's likeness into granite was to promise that his form would endure as long as the mountains themselves. The process began at the quarry. In Aswan, the red granite gleamed beneath the sun. Workers split blocks from bedrock using dolerite pounders. Heavy stones swung again and again until cracks appeared. Sometimes the quarry still holds their unfinished work, like the famous colossal obelisk, abandoned when cracks appeared, lying still as though the workers had just stepped away. From quarry to workshop, the blocks were dragged on sledges, watered sand reducing friction, hundreds of men hauling with ropes in unison. Once inside the sculptor's hands, the raw block was marked with a grid. The canon of proportions governed every measurement. 21 squares from heel to hairline, each part of the body carefully mapped. It was not freedom, but order, a geometry of eternity. Faces emerged slowly, first rough, then smoother, until lips, eyes, and brows took form. Chisels rang, abrasive sand was rubbed. Copper tools wore down quickly and had to be replaced. The sculptor's patience was measured not in hours, but in lifetimes. Among the many tools of these sculptors was one that carried a quiet brilliance. Copper chisels, hardened with arsenic. Pure copper bent too easily, so smiths learned to strengthen it with trace elements. Even then, the tools wore down swiftly against granite's strength. To finish the hardest stones, artisans used pounding stones of dolerite, hammering again and again until surfaces smoothed. Another method, lesser known but ingenious, was the use of desert sand mixed with water to act as an abrasive. With copper, saws and cords, they pulled the grit across the stone, cutting slowly but effectively. This grinding, though tedious, allowed the impossible. Diorite, one of the hardest stones on Earth, could be shaped into serene faces and flawless torsos. The endurance of these methods is visible even today. Statues of pharaohs, carved 4,000 years ago, still gleam with polished surfaces, their forms unchanged by time. The whisper of those chisels lingers in the silence of museum halls, long after the tools themselves have vanished. Statues were not portraits in the modern sense. They were ideals, embodiments of kingship and divinity. A pharaoh's statue was not meant to capture his individual features, but his eternal role. The jaw strong, the eyes wide, the posture upright, the limbs bound in symmetry, all repeated the same canon across centuries. Yet within this canon, subtle differences emerged. The stern, ageless kings of the Old Kingdom softened into more natural forms in the Middle Kingdom, with lines etched into faces, acknowledging human frailty. In the reign of Akhenaten, proportions stretched and shifted, torsos elongated, faces narrowed, as though the very canon bent to new beliefs. But always the stone remained still, silent, eternal. Queens too were carved with majesty. Nefertiti's likeness, though most famously in painted limestone, was also coaxed from harder stone, her neck long, her features balanced. The statues stood as guardians of ritual, placed in temples, tombs, and palaces. They were not decoration, but presence, vessels through which offerings were made, prayers given, eternity secured. Even the smallest statues carried weight. A figure only a hand's length tall, carved from diorite, might be placed within a tomb representing the deceased, in eternal service. The scale did not lessen the meaning. In every size, the stone was divine. The workshop quieted as dusk fell. Chisels rested beside half-finished forms. Dust settled slowly over the floor, softening the edges of tools and stone alike. The statues, though incomplete, already radiated stillness, as if waiting patiently for their final polish. Outside, the Nile flowed past, carrying silt and reeds, while inside the stone endured, unmoving, unyielding. The sculptors laid their tools down gently, washing the dust from their hands, leaving behind faces that seemed almost alive. In torchlight, the polished surfaces gleamed faintly, catching shadows like memories. The statues would soon leave the workshop, carried to temples, set within tombs, placed before altars. There they would wait, motionless, bearing witness to offerings of bread, beer, and incense. They would not speak, but their silence was presence. They stood as guardians, embodying kingship, embodying eternity, embodying the order of the cosmos itself. The chisels have long fallen silent, their metal worn away, yet the statues remain, unmoving, gazing into endless time. Each face still bears the canon, each surface the sculptor's devotion, and in their silence, whispers of the hammer still linger. The desert hills sloped gently above the Nile's western bank, their limestone faces pale against the rising sun. Nestled in a small valley lay a village unlike any other, a cluster of mud brick houses, narrow streets, and shaded courtyards. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, no different from countless others. But this was Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans. Here, the workers of the pharaoh lived, the sculptors, the painters, the scribes, the men who carved and decorated the royal tombs hidden deep in the Valley of the Kings. Each morning, the village stirred in quiet rhythm. Doors opened, footsteps echoed, and tools were gathered with care. The houses were modest, but carefully arranged. Each home contained a small front room, often with a shrine to household gods, a courtyard where bread was baked and pots were fired, and narrow stairs leading to a rooftop where families slept on warm nights. The air carried the scent of baking, bread, of wet clay drying, of limestone dust clinging to garments. Artisans rose with the dawn, greeted by the call of roosters and the low murmur of voices. In the cool morning air, they prepared their tools: wooden mallets, chisels of copper and bronze, fine brushes made from reeds, string coated with red ochre to mark straight lines, and plumb bobs to test alignment. Each tool was simple, but in steady hands, they became instruments of eternity. After gathering, the men left the village together, walking the narrow paths across the desert hills. Their destination was always hidden, the tombs cut into stone valleys where the pharaohs of Egypt would be laid to rest. The journey was short but silent, a ritual in itself, as if the very air knew the weight of their labor. Life in Deir el-Medina was structured, and it left behind one of the most detailed records of daily existence in ancient Egypt. Written on scraps of limestone and shards of pottery, known as ostraca, were notes, letters, and even jokes. These fragments reveal that the artisans were literate, unusually so compared to most Egyptians. Among these writings are records of absences from work. One man wrote that he stayed home because of a scorpion bite, another because his wife was ill, another simply because he was brewing beer. These small notations breathe life into the quiet rhythm of the village. Even as they painted gods and carved eternal scenes, they also paused for family, illness, and the simple joys of their daily lives. Inside the royal tombs, silence was deep and almost heavy. The artisans worked by the light of oil lamps, the air thick with smoke and dust. Walls were smoothed, sketches drawn, lines corrected by masters, and reliefs carved into stone. Painters followed, filling the scenes with colors ground carefully from minerals and bound with gum. The work was demanding, precise and secret. Tombs were hidden from view, designed to guard the pharaoh's journey into eternity. The artisans carried within them knowledge of passages, chambers, and rituals unseen by others. To live in Deir el-Medina was to live in trust, bound by duty, protected by secrecy. At day's end, the men returned to their village. Children ran to greet them, wives prepared evening meals, neighbors exchanged words in the narrow streets. By torchlight, the houses glowed softly, and the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the low hum of music filled the air. For a moment, the artisans were not servants of eternity, but fathers, husbands, and friends. The village lived on the rhythm of work and rest, of devotion and return. On festival days, they gathered to honor Hathor or Amun, their voices lifted in songs, their feet moving in dance, their hearts eased by beer and bread. On quieter nights, they prayed in small household shrines, offering flowers and food to the gods who watched over their homes. Even in leisure, art surrounded them. Ostraca reveal sketches, quick drawings of animals, dancers, even playful caricatures, glimpses of the artisans' lighter side. Though their official work was bound by strict canons, their private drawings showed freedom, humor, and imagination. Yet always, the silence of their greater task remained. Beyond the laughter, beyond the painted ostraca, lay the tombs, vast, solemn, and eternal, waiting in the hills nearby. Deir el-Medina sleeps now, its houses in ruins, its streets buried in sand, but the walls of the tombs still glow with their painted touch. Every brushstroke, every chisel mark, a memory left behind, and silence folds once more around their secret labors. The workshops of Thebes and Memphis were filled not with towering blocks of stone, but with objects so small they could rest upon a fingertip. In the glow of flickering lamps, goldsmiths bent close to their benches, their eyes steady, their hands unwavering. Metal clinked softly, files whispered against surfaces, and the faint smell of heated resin lingered in the air. Here, divinity was not only vast, it was also miniature. Gods could dwell in charms no larger than a thumb, in amulets worn against the chest, in scarabs carried inside linen wrappings of the dead. To hold one of these small creations was to hold eternity itself, condensed into a delicate form. The scarab beetle was among the most common, yet most powerful of these symbols. Each one was shaped with care, its back rounded and polished, its underside carved with hieroglyphs of protection, names, or prayers. To the Egyptians, the scarab was sacred, for it mirrored the dung beetle rolling its ball of earth across the ground, a reflection of the sun god Ra rolling the sun across the sky each morning. Placed upon the chest of the deceased, the scarab became a heart amulet. It whispered on behalf of the soul during judgment, silencing accusations, ensuring the heart would not betray its owner before Osiris. Tiny though it was, its role was immense, to secure safe passage into eternity. Other amulets took the form of ankhs for life, jed pillars for stability, or eyes of Horus for healing. Each shape carried a meaning as weighty as a temple wall, and yet all of them nestled easily into the palm of a hand. Goldsmiths and lapidaries worked with a wide palette of materials: carnelian glowing red as fire, turquoise bright as sky, faience shimmering in glazed blue, and electrum gleaming with the luster of sunlight. Every material was chosen with intention, its color and texture bound to the spiritual power it was meant to carry. Among these countless charms was one that held a role both delicate and profound: the 2 fingers amulet. Crafted in the shape of a tiny pair of outstretched fingers, it was placed on the body near the embalming incision. Its purpose was to protect the wound, to guard the vulnerable place where the body had been opened for mummification. So small, so easily overlooked, yet its meaning was immense. It was not decoration, but safeguard, a gesture of care for the body's eternal integrity. In its miniature form, it carried an entire philosophy: that every detail mattered, that eternity was guarded not only by great temples, but by the quiet presence of a charm no larger than a fingernail. In the royal workshops, master goldsmiths used inlay techniques of astonishing delicacy. They hammered gold into thin sheets, folded and soldered them, then set tiny pieces of lapis, turquoise, or colored glass into the grooves. The result was jewelry that gleamed with more than beauty. It carried the light of eternity. Necklaces of faience beads, strung with amulets, were worn both in life and in burial. Rings bore protective signs. Pectorals, broad chest ornaments, bore figures of gods spreading their wings over the wearer. Though these objects glittered, they were not made for adornment alone. They were shields of the spirit, woven into the fabric of belief. Children wore amulets to ward off illness. Mothers wore them during childbirth for protection. Kings carried them into battle. In death, the body was clothed in dozens of them, each amulet placed with ritual precision, each charm positioned to shield a part of the spirit's journey. The Tomb of Tutankhamun revealed this practice in extraordinary detail. Within his wrappings lay hundreds of amulets, nestled layer upon layer, from scarabs to ankhs, each serving as a silent guardian. Even the most delicate toe and finger coverings were crafted in gold, each piece a reminder that the body, even in smallest part, was sacred. To walk through an ancient tomb, even now, is to feel the echo of these miniatures. A glint of blue faience catches the light. A scarab rests in dust, its carved lines still sharp. A fragment of amulet, no larger than a pebble, lies forgotten, yet powerful. The artisans who made them are nameless, their hands long vanished, yet their touch endures. Every line carved into a scarab's back, every feather etched into the wing of Isis, every fold hammered into a sheet of gold still whispers of their devotion. Their scale was small, but their purpose was infinite. In the silence of the workshop, as the lamp's flame dimmed, an artisan might have set down his tool and held the finished amulet in his palm. He would have turned it once, twice, watching the light glimmer across its surface. Then, with quiet certainty, he would know. This little charm carried the weight of heaven. A scarab rests in the hollow of a hand, still warm from its maker's touch. Tiny wings, tiny signs, tiny prayers etched into stone and gold, each no larger than a breath, yet eternal in its silence, and the smallest charms still hold the weight of heaven. The great temples of stone and the treasures of gold often claimed the gaze of history. Yet, behind the glittering halls and eternal monuments, the quieter music of daily work filled the Nile Valley. It was not sung by choirs, nor played by harps, but hummed in the rhythm of the potter's wheel, in the gentle tug of the loom, in the steady pulse of hands repeating their craft. In these sounds lived another kind of eternity, not carved into stone, but woven into the air, passing softly from one day into the next. The potter's workshop stood close to the riverbanks, where clay was rich and pliable. In the cool shade, a man pressed his heel against the wheel's lower stone, setting it into motion. The wheel spun with a low, steady hum, its turning matched by the slow rise of a vessel under his hands. The clay responded like a living thing, his palms pressed, his fingers shaped, and a jar lifted upward, its neck narrowing, its lips smoothing. Around him, unfinished pots rested in neat rows, drying in the sunlight. Some would hold grain, others water, others offerings placed gently before household shrines. Each jar was ordinary, yet necessary. Beside him, children sometimes molded scraps of clay into little figures or animals, their play echoing the gestures of their fathers. The workshop was not silent. It carried the rhythm of breath, the murmur of water splashing in basins, the scrape of tools smoothing the surface of clay. These were the sounds of sustenance, vessels rising to hold the lifeblood of the Nile. Elsewhere, the weaver sat before her loom, threads stretched like the horizon before her. With practiced motion, she lifted the heddle, passed the shuttle, and pressed the weft down firm. The loom creaked gently, a wooden heartbeat marking time. The linen threads, spun from flax harvested along the Nile's edge, were fine yet strong. Woven together, they formed cloth that could be plain for daily wear or dyed in soft hues of red, blue, or yellow for the wealthy. Patterns sometimes echoed the river's flow, the crossing of reeds, or the geometry of the sky above. In tomb paintings, we see these moments frozen. Women bent over looms, men twisting fibers into cord, spindles whirling between fingers. The work was communal, rhythmic, and often accompanied by quiet song. The weaver's music was not recorded, yet we may imagine it. Voices rising and falling like the river itself, threads of sound woven with threads of cloth. Among the many, crafts, basketry held a special place, though it is often overlooked. From reeds and palm fibers, Egyptians wove baskets of every shape, to carry fish from the river, to store grain in the home, to cradle infants in their earliest days. What is less well known is how finely skilled this work could be. Archaeologists have found baskets woven so tightly from papyrus fibers that they still hold their form after thousands of years. Some carried delicate, almost decorative patterns, where strands of varying shades created a subtle design. Even in the simplest of crafts, the Egyptian maker's hand pursued both function and beauty. A basket might never stand in a temple, but it held within it the quiet artistry of a life lived beside the river. In every village, the air carried the same, quiet chorus. The stonecutter tapped at grinding slabs, turning grain into flour. The leatherworker stretched hides into sandals. The bead maker pierced tiny holes into faience discs, stringing them into necklaces bright as water under sunlight. Each workshop contributed not to grandeur alone, but to the steady rhythm of survival. Food stored in jars, bodies clothed in linen, walls furnished with mats, lamps lit with oil in clay vessels. These were the threads of daily life, spun by countless unseen hands. Even the grandest of kings relied on this hidden orchestra. The gold-capped obelisks and richly painted tombs were surrounded by the humbler music of potters, weavers, and carvers. The splendor of eternity stood upon the shoulders of these small labors. On the walls of tombs in Thebes, scenes of craft unfold with loving detail. Potters turn their wheels, weavers draw their looms, carpenters bend to saw planks of wood. These images were not merely decoration, They were invitations to eternity, ensuring that the skills of daily life, the bread baked, the jars filled, the cloth woven, would accompany the soul beyond the grave. In these painted scenes, the artisans are not nameless. They are preserved in their motion, caught forever in the act of creation. Theirs was a music too fragile to survive in sound, but captured in image, it still lingers. The music of the hands was soft, yet unending. The wheels spun, the loom creaked, the fibers twisted. Nothing was hurried. Each gesture was repeated as it had been the day before, and as it would be the next. The Nile's rhythm found its echo in these crafts. Just as the river rose and fell in patient cycles, so too did the work of potters, weavers, and basket makers flow in steady repetition. Their songs were simple, carried not in words but in movements, in patterns, in the hush of air stirred by hands at work. A jar cooled in the sun, its surface still warm from the shaping hand. A loom held its threads, waiting for the shuttle to pass again. The village hummed with quiet rhythms, soon to fade into dusk, and the songs of their labor still drift faint into the air. The desert lay vast and silent, yet within it rose shapes of impossible scale. Obelisks, temples, colossi of kings, each stone cut and placed with precision that seemed timeless. These monuments did not speak of single days or fleeting seasons. They whispered of eternity, tied to the throne of the pharaoh, to the promise of rule that stretched beyond death. The air shimmered with heat. The shadows of statues lay long upon the sand, and in their stillness, the legacy of the kings endured. But behind the echo of power, another story moved quietly, one of hands that worked and voices that faded. Every pharaoh of Egypt sought to inscribe his reign into the landscape. Some raised pyramids that caught the sun at dawn. Others lined processional ways with statues of lions, rams, or sphinxes. Walls were layered with hieroglyphs declaring victories, rituals, and offerings to the gods. To walk through Karnak or Luxor, or to descend into the Valley of the Kings, was to step inside the pharaoh's vision of eternity. These were not private works. They were declarations, carved and painted for gods to see, but also for people. Reminders that the king was both ruler and divine presence, both mortal and eternal. And yet, for every block raised, for every image carved, there stood not the pharaoh, but countless unnamed artisans. Quarrymen cut the stone, laborers hauled it, masons smoothed it, sculptors shaped it, and painters brought it to life with color. Their footsteps wore faint paths through the dust. Their echoes were softer than the inscriptions they created. From earliest dynasties to the reign of Ramses and beyond, the pharaoh's image was everywhere. In statues, he stood in idealized form, youthful, perfect, unchanging. On temple walls, he towered over enemies, smiting them in a single gesture. In reliefs, he offered gifts to gods, repeating the eternal ritual of devotion. This was not portraiture as we know it today. The face of the pharaoh was never simply his own. It was a sacred mask, shaped by the canon of proportions, polished by the hand of tradition. To depict the king was not to capture his likeness, but to affirm the order of the cosmos. And so, artisans carved and painted him endlessly, their tools repeating lines already thousands of years old. In their repetition, they bound the king to the rhythm of eternity. Among the grand images of kings, one detail often overlooked is the practice of kings' lists. These were carved sequences of royal names, stretching back across centuries. Some pharaohs, like Seti-Thraimata Abydos, commissioned long lists of predecessors, each name carefully inscribed. Yet here lay quiet politics, for certain kings were deliberately omitted. The heretic Akhenaten, who raised the sun disk Aten, was erased from many lists, his name chiseled out, his memory denied. The artisans' hands carried out this work of removal just as carefully as they carved honor into stone. It was an artistry of memory itself, preserving what was to be remembered and smoothing away what was to be forgotten. Few names of artisans survive. Occasionally, a foreman of Deir el-Medina signed his work, or a draftsman scribbled notes on ostraca left behind in the dust, but most hands remained anonymous. The lines they carved were signatures enough, though no one knew their names. They worked in teams, living close to their projects, dedicating years to a single monument. Their families grew up in the shadows of colossal works. Their meals were taken within earshot of chisels striking stone. By daylight, they followed the grid of proportions. By firelight, they rested in houses filled with the same clay jars, the same linen, as any other villager. Their touch remains on the walls, though their voices dissolved into silence. Consider Ramses II at Abu Simbel, where colossal seated figures, each more than 60 feet high, guard the temple entrance. Tourists today stand small at their feet, but even in ancient times, they must have seemed overwhelming. Or think of Hatshepsut, who raised terraces at Deir el-Bahri, a temple merging into the cliffs, its colonnades catching the morning light. Within, reliefs tell of her divine birth, her trading expeditions to the land of Punt. Each monument was both devotion and proclamation. Devotion to the gods, proclamation of the king's place in the cosmos. They were not simply buildings, but statements in stone, messages across eternity. Yet stone too eroded, paint faded, sand drifted in to cover once bright scenes. The monuments endured, but in altered silence. The pharaohs who raised them passed into history, their voices quieted. The artisans who built them left behind no monuments of their own. Their legacy was not in their names, but in the surfaces they touched. Every groove of chisel, every brushstroke of color, bore the memory of hands now dust. The grandeur remains, but it is softened by time, blurred at the edges, as if the desert itself has whispered over it for centuries. A colossus still gazes across, the plain, its face worn by wind. Hieroglyphs still catch the light, though their paint is long gone. The pharaoh's legacy lingers in stone, yet behind it, unseen, are other lives. And in the silence of the desert, their touch can still be felt. The desert wind softened as it met the cliffs of Thebes. Beneath those cliffs, unseen from the wide river, a valley folded inward, quiet and secret. The Valley of the Kings, and nearby, the Valley of the Queens, places where silence was chosen, where stone was carved not to be seen, but to hold eternity within. Above, the sun blazed unrelenting. Below, in hidden passages, coolness lingered. Here the artists of Deir el-Medina, with steady hands and slow breath, painted walls that were meant to last forever. They painted not for the eyes of the living, but for the dead, and for the gods, who measured time. Inside those tombs, torchlight once danced upon the walls. It revealed corridors unfolding like scrolls, chambers spreading like constellations. Every surface was covered, ceilings painted deep blue, scattered with golden stars, walls glowing with ochre, turquoise, and green. Scenes unfolded in sequence, guiding the soul of the pharaoh on its journey. Here, he met the gods, offered libations, sailed with Ra in his solar bark, faced the dangers of the underworld, and emerged reborn with the rising sun. The texts and images together were spells, protective and precise. The Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Litany of Ra. These were not mere decorations. They were instructions, maps of eternity, rehearsals of rebirth. Every line of hieroglyph carried sound and power. Every god painted in profile stood as guardian. And though centuries have passed, the colors still glow in some chambers, as if the artisans left their breath in the paint. To prepare these tombs, the work began long before death. Pharaohs ordered their chambers early, knowing eternity could not be rushed. Teams of quarrymen hacked corridors deep into limestone cliffs. Stonemasons smoothed the surfaces, leaving flat plains of pale stone. Draftsmen came next, tracing red grid lines, marking proportions and figures. Correctors adjusted in black ink, ensuring balance. Then sculptors incised the drawings, or painters filled them with color. layers of pigment bound with gum, pressed carefully into the stone. The artisans worked in silence, sometimes for decades, their lives intertwined with the unfinished tomb. They painted under flickering lamps, smoke curling against the ceiling, their own shadows mingling with the figures of gods. It was slow labor, measured and reverent. One rare survival reminds us of their process. Unfinished tombs abandoned at a king's sudden death. In these, we see the steps laid bare. Outlines drawn but never painted, or painted but never carved. A tomb of Ramesses V and VI, for example, preserves such incomplete stages, where one wall holds vivid colors and another only sketched forms. These unfinished works reveal the rhythm of artistry, the passing of tools from hand to hand. They also remind us that time, even for kings, could end before the vision was complete. The colors themselves carried meaning. Yellow for the flesh of the gods, eternal and unchanging. Green for rebirth and growth, the hue of Osiris. Blue for the sky, for the Nile, for the vast dome of heaven. Red for energy, for power, and at times for danger. These pigments were ground from earth itself, ochre from the desert, malachite and azurite from mines far away, soot for black, crushed, mixed, bound with gum or egg. They became not just paint, but prayers in substance. When brushed onto the wall, they transformed the tomb into a living cosmos, where stone dissolved into myth. And in the still air of those chambers today, one can almost taste the dust of color still lingering. Centuries passed. The tombs, sealed with stone, held their silence. Torches went out. Footsteps ceased. Dust settled. Yet within, the colors endured. In the darkness, Ra still sailed. Osiris still judged. Stars still shone on the ceilings. Though no eyes looked upon them, the stories remained intact, waiting. When grave robbers came, they sought gold, not paint. They broke doors, overturned coffins, carried off treasure. But the walls were harder to steal. The artisans' gifts, painted for gods, remained through theft and fire. Even when sand buried the entrances, when languages changed, when kingdoms fell, the tombs waited beneath. In modern centuries, explorers uncovered what had been hidden. The Valley of the Kings revealed chamber after chamber, stairways descending into silence. Among them, the tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed with painted walls glowing bright, astonished those who entered in 1922. The scenes of his burial chamber showed him embraced by Osiris, protected by goddesses, greeted by Anubis. Though young and little known, in life, his tomb carried the full majesty of eternity. Those who discovered it marveled not only at treasure, but at the artistry of the walls, painted 3,000 years before. Now, the tombs lie quiet again. Visitors pass softly, lights kept, dim to protect the paint, voices lowered in reverence. The air remains cool, still carrying the faint breath of pigments, the scent of dust and stone. Each chamber is a pause, a held breath across centuries. The figures on the walls stand motionless, their colors softened by time, but still present, still speaking. They are not voices of kings alone, but of artisans whose brushstrokes guided eternity. The silence of the tombs is not emptiness, it is fullness held still, like water in a vessel, like a flame hidden in a lamp. A ceiling of stars glimmers in the dark. Gods stride sideways across painted walls. The air remembers the dust of color, stirred by ancient hands, and the tombs keep their dreams, deep beneath the stone. Night returned to the Nile, as it always had. The sky stretched wide, scattered with stars, the same constellations that guided the farmers, the builders, the artists of ages past. The river lay dark and glimmering, carrying a low murmur that seemed both ancient and unending. On its banks, palm fronds swayed, their shadows trembling upon the water. The air was warm, touched with the scent of silt and reeds. Somewhere, a nightbird called, And the river, calm and patient, bore the weight of memory. The Nile was never only a river of water. It was a river of time, a river of stories, a river of work shaped by countless hands. Every artisan who drew a line, every sculptor who struck a chisel, every potter who smoothed clay, all had listened to the same flow. Its floods had given clay for bricks, reeds for mats, silt for fields. Its banks had offered limestone and sandstone, ferried by boat to places where temples would rise. Even the rarest stones, granite from Aswan, made their journey by raft, resting upon the current that carried kings' dreams into permanence. The river did not speak loudly. It whispered, always, in ripples and small waves, in the touch of current against shore. It carried the voices of workshops, the laughter of children, the songs of weavers and smiths, and when silence fell, it carried silence too, folding it into the eternal sound of water moving forward. As centuries passed, the works of those artists endured, statues standing firm in temple courts, walls glowing with faint traces of paint, amulets buried and found again. And yet, for all their presence, the names of most who made them slipped away. Few artisans carved their own names into stone. Their pride was bound in service, to Pharaoh, to gods, to the order of Ma'at. Their signatures were strokes of pigment, curves of hieroglyph, proportions kept true to canon. Their memory was entrusted to the river itself, which carried what history forgot. Still, here and there, faint echoes remain. In ostraca, left in the sands at Deir el-Medina, we find sketches and drafts, cartoons of animals, practice lines of hieroglyphs, or scenes never intended for tombs. They reveal the touch of human humor, the experiments of hands that otherwise painted for eternity. The river held all these echoes together, the grand and the ordinary, the solemn and the playful, carrying them onward. In later times, when Greek and Roman travelers came to Egypt, they too stood by the Nile and marveled at the art upon its banks. Herodotus, wandering in the 5th century BCE, described the temples, the pyramids, the painted chambers. He wrote not only of kings, but of the work that astonished him in its detail. Long after the original artisans were gone, their lines and colors inspired new hands. Roman wall paintings borrowed Egyptian motifs. Coptic textiles echoed older weaves. The continuity of artistry, like the river itself, did not end. It flowed, changing yet enduring. Even today, fragments of pigment unearthed from tombs still reveal their original brilliance under careful light. What fades for the eye remains in truth, only folded deeper into time. Imagine standing at the riverbank as the day closed. The sun lowered, turning the water to bronze, then indigo. Boats drifted homeward, sails furled, oars dipping slowly. In a village, children's voices dimmed, replaced by the steady beat of a mortar grinding grain. From a workshop, the last clink of tools rang before nightfall. Fires glowed faintly, cooking meals of bread and beer. And the river watched it all. It remembered without effort. Each reflection upon its surface carried the shape of a statue, the curve of a brushstroke, the outline of a hand. Now, centuries later, the river still flows. Its waters have shifted course, its floods tamed, yet the current remains. At night it murmurs softly, just as it did when artisans paused from their work to drink from its banks. The art endures in silence, temple walls weathered by sand, tombs lying still in the cliffs, fragments displayed in quiet halls. But the true echo is not only in stone and pigment, it is in the rhythm of labor, in the devotion to craft, in the patience of human hands shaping meaning. The Nile remembers each of them, not in names, not in words, but in the simple truth that they worked, they created, and the current bore their gift onward. The river moves under starlight, as it always has. Its surface glimmers with faint echoes of statues, walls, and songs. The waters flow onward, unhurried, toward horizons unseen. And somewhere within its murmur, the artists of the Nile still breathe. Thank you for drifting through this quiet journey along the Nile. We walk beside the artisans who painted walls, carved stone, and shaped eternity with patient hands. Their names may have faded, but their touch still lingers in every temple shadow, every ripple of the river. As you rest now, let the silence of the tombs and the murmur of water carry you gently into sleep. May your dreams hold the colors of eternity, the rhythm of chisels, the glow of dusk upon stone, and the river flowing endlessly onward.